If you watched my Fallout 4 review, I think it's a pretty good addition to the franchise, but I also find it to lack RPG elements, shifting a lot more towards FPS action. Fallout 2 is my beloved entry in the series and one of my favorite games ever, but another pure RPG Fallout game never really happened. With Rescue and out of nowhere, out of early access, came out UnderRail, not to be confused with Undertale. It's a 2D isometric old-school RPG with a science fiction kind of post-apocalypse setting, I guess? And by old school I mean that its mechanics and gameplay are very much Fallout 2 inspired, but maybe a little more refined. Also, before you begin playing the game, I recommend bumping up the font size in the options. On a full 1080p resolution, the font looks like it was designed for ants. Starting a new game will ask you for your difficulty setting as well as something quite interesting: the leveling system. UnderRail offers two leveling systems. The first one is the classic: killing monsters and finishing quests grants you certain amounts of XP, and once you fill up the requirement, you level up. The second one is built around oddities. These are small items you find around the world of UnderRail. You automatically study them when picking them up and earn experience. Once enough experience is gained, you level up. You can study oddities multiple times, but there is an upper limit per oddity, after which studying will stop granting you experience. I found the system to work very well for the first few hours of the game, but it has its drawbacks. If you're stuck on an enemy you cannot beat and you need to level up, this system doesn't allow you to grind monsters for XP, which can be a bit of a bummer if you allocated your stats in wrong places. Your second step will be creating your character, choosing his or her portrait, allocating points between 7 main stats like you did with Special in Fallout series, spending skill points on various skills, and of course selecting 2 starting perks. Yup, this is a lot like character creator in Fallout 1 and 2. Skills also have something called synergies, which means that other skills will benefit from it, which is neat. After that, you're greeted by a short introduction explaining to you that you, yes you, have become an approved citizen of the South Gateway Station, just after the tutorial. You can skip it, but if you're playing for the first time, I recommend giving it a go, as it explains a lot of helpful keyboard shortcuts, which, believe me, come in real handy. The game can be basically controlled by mouse only, but there are many handy shortcuts that make the control of the game much better. After learning a few things, you wake up in your room and you're free to go. Like in Fallout games, the world is open for you from the get-go after the initial location, and I think that's great, but I recommend following the main quest somewhat, otherwise you're gonna die pretty fast by encountering enemies of higher level. On your first quests, you're also gonna die a lot. Why? Well, because just like playing Fallout for the first time, you probably distributed the points in your character wrong. It takes a moment to get used to the system, but once you build your character properly, it plays really well. The game doesn't hold your hand every step, and I really appreciate that. The game presents itself really well using an isometric perspective combined with awesome looking environments with very detailed sprites. But instead of wastelands, you'll be exploring caves, old complexes, junkyards, high-tech stations, and so on. And in these locations you'll be fighting quite the number of rat hounds, giant psi beetles and bandits, possibly robots. If anything to complain about the graphics are the special effects and attacks, which to me look kinda cheap. When battling monsters, the game switches to a turn-based system based on initiative, basically meaning that the highest initiatives go first. You can affect initiative, of course, like initiating combat manually or from stealth. Combat is also placed on a grid, although it allows a lot of flexibility of walking in any direction you want, as long as the tile you aim for is free. What's interesting is that the action point pool is divided into 2 parts. You have movement points, which you can freely spend to move your character, and action points which can be spent on, well, actions, shooting, reloading, healing, using skills and such. But if needed, you can use action points as movement points, but not the other way around. I quite enjoy this mechanic as it allows me as a player to be more mobile in a turn-based combat, unlike Fallout systems where I usually took a whole turn off basically for repositioning. I personally found out the whole combat system enjoyable, hard and unforgiving, but enjoyable. I prefer a mixture of both melee weapons and small guns, and the game allows you just that. Not to mention using various skills in battle can influence them in a big way. You gain skills from perks, but there are also special psi skills, telekinesis and such. You can unlock them at the beginning of the game, but doing so will put a permanent minus 25% health debuff on you. No worries though, you can always go back to the dock at the start and he will unlock these skills for you so you can enable them whenever you want. These are pretty neat, I did try them out, but I went back and loaded my game before the change as I preferred playing with a bigger pool of health. You can also avoid combat using stealth, or use it to sneak around and get positional advantage on enemies, or sometimes even traverse at all. You can also use air ducts to crawl through, spy on enemies and get around. All this makes the combat system very robust, giving way for multiple approaches when it comes to dispatching enemies. Although I'll admit, I still miss the Fallout 2 precision aiming in all of this. Crotch shots were the best shots. Of course, it's not just tactics and skills, the outcome of battle can be changed with the right equipment. There are various ways to obtain such things like looting, but you can also craft items as long as you have components, recipes and skills for it. The game also has a very interesting barter system through which you can trade items. Not only the game doesn't have a single universal currency system, but the NPCs in game look for specific types of items, so dumping them 10 guns where they're looking for 2 armors won't give you much profit. UnderRail has also the old school kind of RPG equipment system where stat descriptions take up half of the screen. But where I find UnderRail to shine the best is probably the dialogue system, something Fallout 4 decided to throw out of the window. The game features 0 voice acting, allowing the developers of the game to go wild on the outcomes of dialogue trees. Almost every type of conflict can be resolved in multiple ways, peacefully, guns blazing, threatening the enemy to back off, or persuading them to your train of thought. For example, I had an encounter with bandits and instead of fighting I convinced them to take me to their leader. The goons were pretty easy to persuade, but the boss was a bit more stubborn. If I had more skill points in persuasion, maybe this would have gone a different way, but I had to back down to brute force. But I love it. I love that the game gives you options, and if one way fails, there's always another one. One thing I will complain about the dialogues and writing is very slow world building. There's very little exposition on what this underground world actually is, what happened in the past and such. There are some subtle hints here and there, and since your character has lived in this world already, it's not alien to him. So he doesn't ask many questions about the past. As the player though, I felt a little bit alienated at times. The game does a good job of explaining the current political status of its world, its locations, factions, enemies, but the past, not so much. Last thing of note is the music. It's got this dark ambient feel to it which really fits the game's world, and it's clear its inspiration was Fallout 1 and 2's soundtrack. Even some audio cues are very familiar, but at the same time, they feel like they belong. Pretty sure you could play Fallout's soundtrack in the background and it would fit well. Overall, I kind of fell in love with UnderRail. It's the exact kind of open game with 0 handholding that is brutal when it comes to making errors. And as a person who sometimes enjoys punishment in video games, I cannot recommend this game enough. And it's probably gonna become one of my favorite games of 2015, even though it released so late. It has a very simple system on the surface, yet turns out to be much more than that underneath it. It never felt like a rip-off too, like a clone of another game. Instead, it felt like a great homage to one of the greatest games. And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more. I do more indie reviews, I do first impressions, I sometimes let's play games and sometimes play and review DOS games. My name has been TRG and I will see you next time. Bye bye.